The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events, the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high-quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video aired has a special discount code for today only in the comments section with a link to the video offered. And to see everything we do, or if you want to receive notice of new releases, new products, and new events for artists, simply click the other link, which says, "See everything we do." Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes with Plein Air and Fine Art Connoisseur magazines. We hope you're enjoying this special time when you can learn and grow as an artist. Today we have a very special video for you, Classical Portraiture with Joshua LaRock.
Well, hey you guys, welcome back. This is our second day in our multi-stage process of making a portrait painting. So what we've done is we did our drawing. I went ahead and I made a couple photocopies of that drawing, and I enlarged it to whatever size I thought might be nice. Usually I'm kind of sticking with like a 7.5 inch high head. That's just like 3/4, just under life size. Usually looks pretty good. But I did do two different sizes. So this is 7 inches. This one is 7.5, just so that I could kind of take it up to my canvas and get a sense of how big it was going to be on the canvas, how much space I've got around it, around the portrait. I do think that I'm probably going to go with the slightly smaller one, just for the sake of the composition. I do like the larger one though. But this is totally up to you, There's a bunch of different ways to do transferring, so I'm just going to show you one particular method. I used to do graphite transfers for years, so that would be exactly the same as what I'm going to show you here today, but using graphite on the back of the photocopy or the piece of tracing paper instead of oil paint. But first things first, we need to kind of figure out where we want this to be on the canvas. I think I'm going to do something like that. The other thing that's nice about this transferring process is it gives you a little bit of an option value. So you can kind of make some adjustments. You can tilt. I think what I'm doing here is I'm kind of tilting it just a little bit more. I was looking at the drawing overnight and sort of thinking, well, what would it be like if I kind of just put it over to the left on the canvas and give it a slight tilt? So maybe there's like a sense of movement to it rather than being quite so sort of vertically stacked. I have in the past before, if I wanted to kind of like change the orientation of the head on the shoulders, you actually could cut out the head from the photocopy and just sort of like play with it, almost as if it was like sort of Photoshop. You could do it in Photoshop if you wanted. So, there's all kinds of options that you have to be able to just sort of tweak the pose, tweak the expression and character. Some other ideas about composition. In general, with a portrait, it's nice to have, if you're imagining a midline, a vertical midline that's halfway between either side, if I'm imagining it being somewhere like right here, you don't want the chin to be too far off of that midline. Rules are always made to be broken, but I think that's just a decent rule of thumb. In this case, I'm kind of just thinking about positioning her a little bit more to the left side of the canvas than to the right. So there's going to be a little bit more empty space here than there is here. And I can kind of just take a brush and just do like a quick little measurement, so to see that they're almost equal. Maybe I'll just emphasize that a little bit more. Maybe that just gives it a little sense of that movement that I was talking about. So I can see that the middle of my canvas is lining up right with the corner of that near eye. kind of have a look at it here. Another thing is I've got the head higher up on the canvas rather than lower down, right? So part of that's so that I make sure that I have enough room here for the seam of the shirt to meet well within the bounds of the canvas. And I think that looks pretty interesting. Got just a little bit more of a tilt than I had yesterday, but it's still conceivable that she's sitting upright in a chair or standing or whatever. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that taped there. Now what we've got to do is prepare our transfer paper. Okay. You could put the oil right on the back of the photocopy or the graphite or whatever, but I'm going to actually use a piece of tracing paper that we'll put up underneath that. Okay. All right, this is any just sort of standard tracing paper. You could use a thin piece of computer paper if you want, but it is important that it's thin so that what we're going to be doing is drawing over this, and so you don't want the paper to be so thick that your pencil or your stylus isn't actually creating that mark. All right. All right, so we can get rid of this. Here's the old drawing. You can see. I've blown it up about 130%, something like that. You can set it aside. Okay. So, as far as materials go, I've got raw umber, just regular raw umber oil paint, and this is a medium called oleo res gel. Basically, it's linseed oil with an alkyd resin mixed in there, and it's made into gel form. You could use really anything. We're just trying to get the paint to sort of slide on there. The alkyd actually hastens the drying time, though, and that's why I like it for this process. We're just looking for something to set up on the canvas relatively quickly. You could do this the day before. You could do this several days before. I'm going to be painting on this right away. So however you like to do that. I do have another medium. This is called transparent base. This is actually a very, very fast drying medium, which could be good for this application. So I might kind of mix that in a little bit here. I've also got my terps container here with GAM salts, just an odorless mineral spirits. I might be dipping in, adding that to the paint on the tracing paper here as I need to just sort of get it to flow out. I will say that this takes a little bit of practice. If you put too much solvent or too much of the mineral spirits in the mixture on the tracing paper here, it can have a trouble when you're putting it on the canvas of being just a little bit too messy, or if you put your hand on it, then it'll be a little bit messier. So it kind of takes a little bit of practice to figure out how much oil paint you want on here, how dry you want it. But what I like about this is I'm not introducing anything foreign to my painting, right? So it's all oil-based things rather than having graphite or charcoal or in the past I used to fix my drawing to the canvas with ink, and that I think can have some adverse effects with the longevity of your picture. Oil paint, as it dries, always gets a little bit more transparent, so it's possible that the ink could eventually show through. All right, so just got a few daubs of the French umber out here on the tracing paper, and I'm going to go ahead and just put a little bit of oleo gel, a little daub next to each of them, and I might do the same thing with this transparent base here. It's kind of dried off on me. Get all the dried bits off there. I'm just going to put a little bit of that on, maybe half as much. We'll see how far that gets us. But again, that's just to maybe help this dry a little bit faster. So just an old kind of bristly brush here, sort of beat up, just to help me kind of move this around the canvas, the tracing paper. What we're going to do here in a second is remove any of the excess so that only the very thinnest amount of oil paint remains remains on the tracing paper. You could do this with any color, really. I like raw umber because it's dark enough that it's going to show up on the tone of my canvas, but it's not so dark or red that it's going to be tough to cover up with my first layer of paint. All right, so we kind of got our layer there. Let's take a fresh piece of paper towel and just sort of remove the excess. All right, so before I put this transfer paper up here, I was just looking at the picture from a distance, standing back, and I just felt like I wanted to make a slight adjustment to the composition by just moving this down a little bit. Maybe there's just, a little bit more space above the top of her head, and a little bit less here at the bottom. Not much, but I still like that tilt. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to take the transfer paper. We're going to put the oil painted side facing the canvas, sandwiching it underneath the drawing, and then I can kind of just stick it here with the two pieces of tape that I've already got there. All right, now here I'm going to use my 4H pencil. It's just a harder pencil as opposed to the H. You could use either. I've used a ballpoint pen before. I've used a red ballpoint pen so that you can see the lines very clearly that you've already done. But whatever works. We just need some sort of hard stylus to be able to make an impression. So I'm just going to start here with the eye. Really just looking to kind of do a very simple transferring the major structures of the portrait. We'll get a lot of the information back throughout the course of the underpainting, but we're going to be transferring better lines even if we're not transferring all of the detail, right? So by going through the process of the drawing yesterday, we've ended up with a better drawing, and we've connected with it better, and so we'll still have the drawing as a reference for us during the painting and all that. So it don't feel like it's a loss. Just sort of be okay with the fact that it's not going to look quite as good in the transferred image. But there are other ways to do transfers. Oftentimes we'll use a projector. So I'll scan my drawing into the computer, just using any standard old office desk scanner, and then you can use the digital projector to project it onto your canvas, and then you have all kinds of options there. You can make it larger, you can make it smaller, you can move it around and kind of play with all those things. So it can be a really nice tool. So just coming up over here to the other eye. I'm trying not to put too much pressure with my hand onto the drawing or the transfer paper, because I don't want to have any stray marks, or as little as I can in any way. Coming down here to the other eye, over to the eyelashes, doing the iris, corner of the eye here. And I'm picking and choosing. I'm not transferring these lines like the side of the nose, where it's very very much in the light. It's very high value. I don't want to have to try to cover up my transfer lines. It's good too at some point to just kind of like peek and sort of see how's the transfer looking. So we're doing good there. All right, so let's continue on down the side of the cheek. And I'm trying not to make decisions here, because I've made this, about 130% larger than the drawing, then slightly thicker than what they were in the drawing itself. So I don't want to make the decision here which line is correct or which edge of the line. I'm going to transfer the full thickness of that line, if that makes sense. So. But anyway, all things are still fixable. I think I used to, be a lot more stressed out about this kind of this part of the process, and worried that it was going to make or break my painting. And I think as I've gone on and had more experience and got more comfortable with underpainting, then I really realized that this is a very just low stress kind of thing. We've got all kinds of opportunities left and time left to correct mistakes, to make the drawing better, and all that. So just kind of coming around here, finding the edge of the contour of the hair. I'm not the hair. I'm even less worried about than other parts because, as I say, it's gonna get designed kind of throughout the painting process. And as I see, slightly different ways that the hair is falling, or some lock that just sort of catches my interest. Moving pretty quickly here. Maybe just an indication of the buttons. There's the cast shadow again on the neck. And that gets sort of fuzzy here, so I don't really need to transfer that. Here's that really nice line for the side of the neck that comes down and meets the necklace. All right, I think that was everything. So let's just take a second and double check. So like kind of like a cartoon, an illustrator or whatever, just kind of flipping it back and forth and seeing if I missed anything that was really major. Maybe no. See, I was going to transfer the top of the collarbone here because that's sort of an important anatomical structure. But then I think I'm just going to kind of leave it, and we'll find it in the paint. Because this is just so soft and so brightly illuminated that I don't want to have to try to cover up those transfer lines. So I think we're okay. Okay, and there we have it. All right, so transfer's done. Now we've just got to set up our palette and get to the painting. Okay, so let's take a second here to talk about materials. I've got materials that I'm just used to using that I've found and that work well. They are high quality, and I really do like them and recommend them. But I always like to just sort of give a certain disclaimer that says that use what you're used to. You can. All the principles are going to apply no matter what brand you make or you use. So don't feel like you have to go out and buy exactly what I've got here in order to be able to do the same techniques and things that I'm going to be talking about. That being said, though, I do love to use rosemary brushes. They are really high-quality paintbrush maker. And so we've put together a set together for my portrait painting. This is the basic set. I do have sort of like a more extended one, which has some bigger brushes that I use for varnishing or massing and things. But this is just a collection of kind of like my most often used brushes when I'm painting. I do like rounds, the shape of the brush to be round. Generally, I do have some sort of flats and filberts and things, which just give you a little bit of variety. The main thing that I kind of want to show you here is I do have two sort of different textures to the brush, right? So one of the main things that I'll be using is this golden synthetic. Okay, so this is a number 10. It's one of the larger brushes that I use. I'm more of a detail painter, and you'll see as time goes on. But I do tend to use more of the smaller brushes, like the 0s, 2s, 4s, things like that. But the thing that I want to kind of show you here is that this is it's a softer brush, so it's a synthetic sable. It's mimicking a soft sable hair brush. At a lower cost, right? Sables are great if you can get your hands on it. But anyway, you can sort of feel the texture here. And then you can contrast that with sort of a stiffer textured brush. So this is what they call their ivory. This is a synthetic bristle. And so it's just going to have a stiffer texture. Now, depending on how much paint you load into the brush, whether it's the stiffer brush versus the softer one, you can make different marks. So really, it just gives you some variety. It gives you another tool in your belt to create the effect that you're after. If you've got a stiffer brush and you're just not getting the paint to lie down, well, then we'll get a softer brush out and load more paint in it, and that should allow it to stick to the canvas a little bit more easily. And so then I've got a variety of sizes down, like I said, to this is one of the smaller ones. This is a 0 synthetic golden brush. That's a round. I do have one of these, what they call an evergreen in there. This is a filbert. It's just kind of a nice, it's actually sort of somewhere in between in terms of texture. So it's a little softer than the ivories, a little bit stiffer than the synthetic sables, okay? So that's a really nice brush. I like that a lot. But so we're just looking for the right size brush for the form that we're working on. So smaller forms like eyes and the nose, I'm going to need a smaller brush. For larger forms like the forehead and the chest and things like that, especially the hair, I'll get a larger brush out. Okay, so that's the basic idea for brushes, and you can get this whole set on their website, Rosemary & Co. All right, let's move on to paints and setting up the palette. This is an Edge Pro Gear palette. I really think it's a versatile tool. I use this as my palette in my studio. It's set up on a tripod here, any old camera tripod, and I can change the angle, I can change the height, whether I'm sitting or standing, so it works out really well. I use this for plein air painting because you can attach your panel here to the front of the box, close it up like a laptop, and put it in a backpack, so it's pretty nice. I've got a canister here that has my Gamsol in it, and it's pretty cool. They've got a little magnet epoxied in the bottom, and so it sticks here to this metal tray, and that's saved me a lot of trouble because I'm notorious for just knocking the Gamsol over and spilling it out all over my studio. This is a palette cup that we'll use later. We'll talk about mediums in subsequent days more in depth. But let's talk about the colors that I'm using and how I have it set up. All right, so the first and most important pigment that I use is lead white. Now, I use whenever I can the Rublev line of colors. That's from a company called Natural Pigments. They just do a really good job of making high quality paints. They hand grind them. They grind them to different particle sizes, which has a certain way of affecting the way that the paint handles. So other makers like Winsor Newton or whatever, they're grinding the particles smaller so that it has a certain kind of consistency that's sort of butterier. But so that's kind of goes a little bit further beyond sort of like the scope of this video. But for whatever take it for what it's worth. That they do a really nice job. Now, this is their lead white number 2. So it's lead white that's been ground in walnut oil as opposed to linseed oil, and so the walnut oil is just a little bit brighter than the linseed oil, which tends to be just a touch darker. But they're both great. So I like the lead white number 2. Now I have put this in a different tube. One of the their tenets of Rublev, one of their philosophies is they try not to put any additives into their mixture, into their paints, which most other companies do because they're looking for a longer shelf life. Well, Rublev is trying to get away from that because it has it does affect how the paint goes down, affects how it dries and things like that. But one of the downsides of not putting any additives in it is that the oil can kind of separate and the paint can dry in the tube. So I've had to kind of regrind this and then put it into a different tube. But anyway, this is lead white number 2. I'll go ahead and put that out here on the palette. Now I do have a titanium white as well. This is Michael Harding brand. I just like that. I'm going to use predominantly the lead white, but the titanium white is just it's slightly brighter, slightly more opaque than the lead white, and so I can use that if I really need to kind of push for a higher value, or maybe a little glint on a necklace or her eye or something like that. All right, so then I'm gonna start laying out my yellows. You'll notice that I have my yellows and my reds grouped together and a hue family. And we'll talk a little bit more about hue and chroma in a second here. But so this is a lead tin yellow. So it's a very high value, sort of highish chroma, high intensity yellow. Then next I have a chrome yellow light from Rublev. This is, you could substitute this with cadmium yellow and get the same basic note that I'm looking for there on my palette. Next I've got a Blue Ridge yellow ochre, again from Rublev. And then I've got this is a transparent oxide yellow from Michael Harding. So it's an inherently transparent pigment based on how small they've ground the particles. But it's a really nice kind of base mixture for shadows and things like that to give it that sort of like transparent, airy quality. And then the last yellow I've got here is a French umber. Now, this is kind of equivalent to a raw umber that you might find in other brands. But it is a yellow, so I group it with my yellows. It's a very neutral yellow, but it's not a red. So I think that it's really great to remember to put that here with your yellows. That'll make more sense practically when we get into the painting. Okay. Continuing on, I've got this orange molybdate. You could substitute that with cadmium orange and be just fine. It's basically a very high intensity orange. I've got a genuine vermilion, okay, and this is another one that I had to retube because this lasts a long time. It's got a high tinting strength. This is a very expensive pigment because it is genuine. It's the old way of making vermilion. It's not a cadmium. But again, you could substitute this with cadmium and get the same basic idea out of it. It has just a really nice. What I like about vermilion is it has a really nice mixing quality when you put it with lead white or the lead tin yellow. It gets a very beautiful flesh tone. Cadmiums they're stronger, right? So they can be a little bit harder to control. But, you'd be just fine. I used cadmiums for years. All right. Next thing I've got here is an alizarin crimson. So it's sort of a more purple. Violety red. And then next I've got a magenta. This is from Michael Harding again. So Michael Harding and Rublev, they're both really great paint makers. They make them by hand, and they have really, really excellent pigment quality. So whenever you can get a chance to use them, I definitely recommend it. And then my last red here is a transparent oxide brown. So basically, you could substitute this with like a red umber, a burnt umber. Just looking for a darker value, lower chroma red, basically. Reddish brown. All right, so now let's jump over here to the other side of the white. And I like to use Viridian when I'm doing flesh painting. It just gets a really beautiful kind of coolish note. Great for things like veins under skin or like these sort of neutral tones that tend to be right here near the corner of the eyes and the nasal bone. All right, and then I've got an ultramarine blue, so just a pretty standard, beautiful deep blue color. Now it's possible since she's wearing a blue shirt, I may need a slightly higher value, higher chroma blue. So I've got this. This is just an old tube of blue that I've had in my box for a long time. I think it's made by Lefranc. It's just a Lefranc blue, I guess is what they call it. You could substitute this with like a cobalt blue. All right, and then I do like to have a cobalt violet dark. Again, this is by Michael Harding. This will just give us some ability to kind of mix sort of. It can neutralize the yellows. I can use it to make my reds tip a little bit more into the violet direction. So it's just nice to have it on the palette. Not absolutely necessary. And then last, I've got a Van Dyke brown. Now I could probably put this with the yellows or the reds, but I like to put that over here to the side. Now this is sort of just a warm brown. You could make this by mixing ivory black with the transparent oxide red and a little bit of the French umber and get the same basic note. If I want to later, I will actually pull out a little bit of an ivory black, and that'll just be a slightly darker value note than this, though the ivory black tends to tip more towards a bluish hue. And then just for the sake of for mixing it, sometimes I like to add this neutral gray by Michael Harding. It's just what they call a value 5 neutral gray. And so it's good to just have there on the palette to mix with things. Okay, now the only other thing in terms of mediums today for the underpainting, I like to have a little bit of walnut oil. This is basically any old standard walnut oil you can get in a bottle, but they just made it into a gel form. This is going to just, if the paint is too stiff and I want it to flow out a little bit more and be a little bit looser, I can grab a little bit of the walnut oil. And then I do like to have that oleo res gel again. Okay, so this is basically linseed oil in a gel form mixed with a little alkyd resin. So it's going to hasten the drying time. You'll probably see me add that in with the darks of the hair and certain things that I want to remain glossy from day to day. It'll also just keep those darks really nice and rich. Okay, and so that's really it. We've got everything set up here, and let's jump in. All right, a few other things before we get started. Let's talk about the canvas. All right, this is a lead primed Belgian linen that's got a very smooth texture, and it's actually been adhered to a panel. This is called an ACM panel, so it's aluminum composite, and this whole panel is made by a company called Artifacts, and this is called an all-in panel. So it's a really nice alternative to using canvas that's been stretched. It's nice to paint on, but it also actually is really good for the longevity of your picture. So that a lot of times when you see paint cracking in museums over 100 years, it's because it's on a stretched canvas, and as the humidity and temperature and things change over the course of time, that causes the paint to crack. But if I have a canvas adhered to what they call a rigid support, like this is, then that's much less likely to happen. So it's a really good idea to look at these guys. Now what I've done here is I've toned it. I've toned the canvas to be sort of a neutral gray. That was just I did this several days, several weeks beforehand, where it's just that oleo res gel, a little bit of the Van Dyke brown, and some of the Gamsol, and I just took a paper towel, wiped it over the whole thing, let it dry. That's just to kind of kill the white, so that when I'm going to apply color, it doesn't distract my eye. You can definitely paint on a white ground if you like. I've seen people do dark red tones. It's all up to you. But that's what I've got here. I prefer the lighter. I prefer sort of a light neutral tone to the canvas. And then here I've got a maul stick that I'll be using. I'm going to use that to just sort of rest my hand as I'm trying to make my marks. All right, let's dive in. So what we took from yesterday is we understand how values work, right? That there's two different phenomena with light, that there's form light and there's highlight. So form light being how perpendicular are the planes to our light source, and the more perpendicular the plane is, then the brighter it is. Highlight has to do with my position in the room. It's the light actually ricocheting off of the surface of her flesh and entering my eye. Okay, so they're two different things, and they're in two different locations on the portrait. So let's kind of put highlight aside for a second, and let's just concentrate on form light. Now, if I take the forehead here, the plane that's most perpendicular to the light on the forehead is right here. Now, that's the highest value in terms of form light, and it's also going to be the most colorful. Okay, so the more perpendicular the plane is, the higher the value is, the higher the chroma is. That's the intensity, and then the hue we have to determine is it's either sort of a red yellow, right? So we're introducing two more variables to our thought process here. We've got good drawing, we've got good values. Those are by far the most important. And now we need to talk about hue and chroma. So hue, very basically, is just, is it red, yellow, green, blue, or violet? Chroma is how intense is that color relative to neutral, right? So these yellows that I have in my palette over here to the left, these are very high in chroma, right? So it's a very highly chromatic yellow, whereas the French umber is a low chroma, but still in the yellow family, okay? So then the orange molybdate or the cad orange and the vermilion, those are very high chroma colors, and then the transparent oxide brown is a low chroma red, right? So it's more neutral, and it's also darker in value. Okay, so here we're going to have, again, high value, high chroma, and now it's up to me to decide which hue it is. Flesh is always some sort of version of yellow-red. So I just kind of ask myself, is it more yellow or is it more red? I would say on the forehead, maybe it's just a touch more yellow than red. That doesn't mean it's only yellow, just maybe a little bit more yellow than red. And this is a sort of classical convention that foreheads tend to be a little yellower. The nose and eye region tend to be a bit more red. There's more capillaries in the cheeks and things. And then the kind of lower third, the mouth and chin, tend to be a little bit more neutral. You'll see that happen a little bit more, obviously, on portraits of men where you know, if they're shaved and you can see the stubble, that kind of increases the sort of neutrally grayish tones in that region. All right, well, let's just jump in with, got a little lead white. And my paint's a little bit stiff here, so I'm going to grab some of the walnut oil just to kind of loosen that up. So lead white for the high value. And then I'm going to just grab a little bit of that chrome yellow and maybe a touch of the orange. And let's go up here and just kind of test it out. So again, this is an underpainting. So I'm not looking for this to be perfect. It's kind of like the drawing. I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm just going to start to get things down and set up relationships. Set the relationships up as well as I can, but knowing that I've got 2 more days of painting ahead of me, at least, that 2 more layers, that I can make all the corrections that I need. All right. So that seems okay. One thing that I like to think about with underpainting is if I'm going to err on any side, I like it to be a little bit lighter as opposed to darker. It's much easier to correct a value that's too light or a chroma that's too intense than it is to get a lighter value and a more intense color, more chromatic color in later stages if I've gone too dark and too dull. Okay, so try to keep things high in value, high in chroma to begin with, and you can always dull that down later. But again, I'm just assigning values here. Okay, it can't be overstated enough that reality is always going to be brighter and more colorful and more brilliant than anything that I can create here. I've got more range at my disposal than I had in the drawing, but it's still inferior to what I see in front of me. So I'm basically just mixing up the highest value, highest chroma thing that I can on my palette and placing it there. And then now we've got the highlight, which is situated just to the right of that passage that I just painted. So the highlight is higher. It certainly is higher in value, but it's lower in chroma. So I can more or less just sort of push to white. So I'm adding a greater proportion of the lead white to my little puddle on the palette here. So it's going to look funny for a little bit as we just sort of kind of lay things in and get a sense. Now, I probably do see a little bit more color up there than what I'm currently putting down, but I know that if I keep that light and maybe more toward the neutral side, then I can add more color to that later in subsequent passages. And you'll kind of see that. This is kind of one of those things that you sort of have to know the end from the beginning. So once you see the whole process, these decisions will make a little bit more sense. All right, so now we're back up here to form light. This is the highlights kind of covering this region, and this is form light. Now, this plane is slightly less perpendicular to the light than this plane, so I have to make it a little bit darker than whatever I've chosen there. So back to my puddle on my palette that's made up mostly of white, chrome yellow, and the two chromatic oranges and reds. And I just need to make something that's a little bit darker, a little bit less chromatic. So I'm grabbing some of the yellow ochre, a little bit more of the vermilion. And it's still got to be even just a little bit darker, so more of that ochre maybe, a little bit more vermilion. You might have noticed I've kind of got like an older beat up brush. I like to use those for the underpainting because I'm not really looking to make super precise marks, at least at this stage. Gives it sort of a nice softness to the kind of beat up older brushes. So underpaintings. There's a bunch of different ways to make an underpainting. You could do this in black and white. You could do this in grisaille. You could, if you've ever heard of a verdaccio, that's kind of like doing a really green underpainting that I guess sometimes artists like because it plays off of the sort of reddish tones of the flesh, and some of that will kind of like show through. Again, this is sort of like a process that I developed from what I could see the Bouguereau was doing, and he would just use a full palette. So this is basically a full. I've got all my colors out. I'm using the full spectrum of my color space, but it's basically just going to be kind of a very broad, general first pass over the whole picture. So we're just setting up relationships. We're getting the colors. We are advancing the drawing, right? So long as I don't lose the drawing, there's really no way to mess this up. So long as by the end of today, it sits in space. We've got some color. We've thought about the values a little bit more. We've kind of got a sense of how light and how dark things are going to be. Then we're going to be in a good spot. Okay. So I'm just kind of making slightly darker, slightly more neutralized versions of this. Now it's kind of gotten a little bit yellow over here, and that was maybe not absolutely intentional. So I can kind of make that a little bit redder just by adding a little bit more vermilion into my puddle. But mentally, what I'm thinking about is I made my decision here. Okay, that's the most perpendicular plane. That tells me the most about the color of her forehead. And then every other decision, even the highlight, is sort of a derivative of that decision, right? So the highlight's basically just a brighter, more neutral version of that. And these planes over here are basically darker, more neutralized versions of that, still in the same basic hue family, okay? So I'm continuing on, adding a little bit more raw umber. Can probably be a little bit more aggressive with the darker values at this point. I kind of mentioned in the drawing that the closer we get to the terminator, right? So our shadow's over here. The closer we get to the terminator, the quicker the value drops. Okay, so the darker it gets. And so we've got this very broad wash of light, very high in value for a larger surface area. And the closer we get to the terminator, we find those darker notes. Those darker tones. All right, so pretty rough. Doesn't really matter. Just getting something down. What I might do at this point is start to treat the hairline. Okay, so as we move up here, it's a good idea to keep the hairline nice and soft. So it's getting darker, it gets a little bit more neutralized. Sometimes it actually tips a little bit to kind of like a greenish hue. in my head, I kind of explain that to myself as it's sort of you're seeing the hair follicles emerging from the scalp, and from a distance it all kind of averages out. But maybe let's just jump in and put in some darks of the hair. So cleaned off my brush, went right into, I cleaned it off with the Gamsol, and I'm going to put in a little bit of that Oleo Res gel just to kind of make that a little glossier. I pulled from the French umber, the transparent oxide brown, a bit of the Van Dyke brown to get it a little darker. Just looking to kind of mass something in. What I'm after here is I want to see how those things are looking next to one another. It's all context. Okay, so there's no correct value. There's just good relationships, good value relationships, good color relationships. All right, so it's a brown, probably tips a little bit more yellower than red, but just kind of scrubbing this in. One other thing to keep in mind for underpaintings is you generally don't want there to be a lot of medium in those under layers. Okay, it's this very simple kind of fat over lean principle that you want more oil in the upper layers and less oil in those under layers, so that the first layers dry more quickly and the upper layers dry more slowly. If the top layer dries faster than the bottom layer, then that's when you're going to get cracking or this kind of like shrinkage. It almost kind of looks like blisters sometimes in a dried picture. So I've got very little medium, at least compared to what we're going to have going forward. As we move over here, the hair is a little bit lighter. So I was grabbing some of the yellow ochre, the transparent yellow, just kind of dropping that in. Back to a clean brush, mostly the Van Dyke brown, raw umber, transparent brown. Just sort of dropping that in here. I'm going to bring that right up to the edge of the forehead. I always think it's kind of funny where I'll start with the forehead or put the flesh mixture down, and then it looks dark as I'm putting it down, but then when I bring a darker value just up next to it, all of a sudden it looks so much lighter. Okay, then now, mostly this transparent yellow is on the brush. I'm just going to use that to kind of fill in this shadow. So it's sort of similar to what we were doing yesterday with flattening the shadows in graphite, just sort of laying something in. But I'm purposely trying to make it flat, right? I want to set this up to help the modeling in the lights. I'm not too worried about all the variety that's in the shadows. So again, that's just predominantly the transparent yellow. As it gets down here, it does get lighter in value, get a little bit more chromatic because of the reflected light. So I grabbed a greater proportion of the yellow ochre and kind of put that in there, but I don't know. This is just kind of massing something in. Doesn't need to be thought of as correct at this point. Okay. All right, so back to the back to the idea of kind of treating the hairline. I'm going to remix my sort of forehead starting value. So again, white, orange, cat orange molybdate, the vermilion. It's too dark, so a little bit more white, a little bit more of that yellow. So I do a lot of testing, you know, because it looks different down here on the palette, and it's in its own context with this neutral ground, this neutral palette. So by the time I get it up here in the context of the picture, it looks totally different. I'm going to switch brushes just so that I can make sure it's nice and clean. Get out a new paper towel. Grab some more of that white. Looking to find that high value, high chroma again. Oof, the orange is so strong. Maybe I'll add a little bit of the titanium in there. Again, that titanium is just a little bit more opaque, a little bit higher in value than the lead. And that's good and bad. I like the way that lead generally mixes with the other colors and creates just more subtle flesh tones. But I used titanium exclusively for years. I have in recent years learned that lead is actually better for archival purposes. It's more flexible as the paint film ages, so that theoretically, if all other things were the same, it would crack. Lead white would crack less than a titanium-based picture. But there's all kinds of variables to consider. Anyway, just laying some of that in. Now it's getting darker. The planes are getting darker as I move here toward the left contour. So just slightly, though, just slightly. So it's going to get a little darker, a little more neutral. I could neutralize that by just kind of grabbing some of that shadow puddle that I have left over on the palette. I could neutralize it and darken it by grabbing the perfect neutral 5 I have there. This is just very, very general initial lay-in. Okay, and so then now we're kind of ready to treat the hairline here. Really just sort of amounts to putting in an intermediate value between the hair and the forehead mixture. I got maybe a little too dark. So I'm really kind of just grabbing some of the hair mixture right into the puddle of the forehead, and then it makes a value and tone that's sort of halfway in between. But again, if I wanted to maybe cool that off a little bit more, neutralize it, make it a little bit bluer. The Viridian's a great mixture. And then the hair, just as it emerges from the scalp, catches a little bit of highlight, so it's pretty neutral. Just grabbed a little of the neutral to kind of put right in there. I don't know. Not too worried about it at this point. And notice I kind of grabbed a softer brush for a second, just so that I could make a slightly smoother transition. But now I'm back to sort of one of the stiffer brushes. Just looking at the shape of the forehead. Bringing some of the hair down over the top of that forehead. All right, and so now that I've surrounded that form, I can kind of see that these planes need to darken a little bit more. All right. And that's a good thing, because what I'm thinking about is this versus this. It's this value here versus the dark values that I place here. It's eventually going to make that volume feel round. It's going to, if I make things over here too light, and if I make things over here too dark, then that whole thing is going to deflate. The illusion is going to deflate. So I'm thinking within the context of my picture. I'm thinking this versus this, not this versus that, okay? It's really important. We're making an analogy here, right? We're not making a one-for-one copy. I'm going to keep trying to just say that again and again throughout this process, because it's a tough idea. It's like our default. We always just sort of default to wanting to match what we see, and just forgetting that you can't do that it's just impossible because it's limited, because we're limited by our palette. So I'm kind of just treating the transition from the highlight into the form light. This is not nearly as colorful. What I've mixed up here is not nearly as colorful as what I see. And so again, I know that I'm going to get there through the painting process. As we build up the paint in the next couple layers, we might be able to go back in today and hit that. But we're just starting to get some of that context in, so I'm not too worried about it being exact. Okay, so kind of moving down the forehead. These planes here are a little darker, a little less chromatic, a little bit more neutral than the planes up here. Maybe it's starting to tip a bit more into kind of like the pinker hues as opposed to the yellower ones on the top of the forehead. This value over here is kind of bugging me. It's a little bit too dark. Or I'm sorry, it's too light. I want to darken it. Now I can kind of bring the hair down. Soften that edge. Doesn't really matter. Just kind of taking a mental step back here and noticing that I had kind of left out the hair on the bun. So I'm just going to kind of scrub something in here. It's a little bit lighter in value, so the hair itself is actually a little lighter, but it also is catching some more highlight. So I just went into the yellow ochre, transparent yellow. And then as it turns away from the light over here, it gets darker and more neutral. I don't know. Keep saying that because it's, this is really am just making guesses here at this point. I don't really know exactly where this is going to end up. I mean, they're educated guesses. They're not wildly off. I'm thinking about hue. I'm thinking about value. I really am. I have those three variables in my head, and they can be analyzed independently of one another. So, okay, what value is it? Is it light or dark? What hue is it? Is it more yellow? Is it more red? Is it more blue? Whatever. And then is it chromatic or is it more neutral? And then so you kind of synthesize those things together. just sort of treating the edge here. Before too long, I'm probably actually going to scrub in a little bit of the light for the background, the white for the background, to help also with the just sort of contextual effect, I guess. All right, thinking about jumping into the eye here on the near side. I'm just trying to decide if I have the right brush. Kind of just wanted I just want sort of a medium-sized brush here. This is one of those ivories, but I'm going to go right into mostly that transparent yellow. Look toward me just a little bit. Perfect. And just kind of start there. Maybe that's a little bit more chromatic than what I need, so I can, being that it's a yellow, I can neutralize that by adding a little bit of the violet. Purple being the complement of yellow, you can neutralize by adding complements to anything. So you can neutralize a red with a green, you can neutralize a yellow with a violet, you can neutralize an orange with a blue. And I will do that sometimes. I think whenever possible, I do try to neutralize a hue by staying within that hue family, right? So I could have easily just sort of neutralized that by adding more of the French umber, the raw umber, and maybe some of the Van Dyke brown, or even, of course, then just the neutral itself. Now, the neutral has some white in it, so that's going to affect the opacity, right? I want to try to keep the shadows more transparent than the lights. That's just sort of a painting convention. I like aesthetically the way that looks on a picture. That's not something you absolutely need. You can make a great painting that's perfectly opaque throughout. You can make a great painting that's sort of semi-transparent throughout. So none of that totally matters. What matters is the values. Matters is the good drawing. So just laying in that shadow there, then looking at the eyebrow, it kind of catches a little bit of light. There's this intermediate plane. Let me get a different brush here, smaller brush. Intermediate plane here between the brow, the shadow on the brow, and the forehead. So just a little lighter. It's actually a little more neutral because I think what we're seeing is the individual hairs of the eyebrow catching a little bit of highlight, which is more neutral. And so it averages out from a distance to being kind of a more neutral tone. And then into the forehead here. So we've got smaller forms than the forehead, and so I've got a smaller brush out to be able to make these transitions. You can kind of see here I had already laid in a light, then I laid in my shadow, and so I can kind of now take a mixture that's somewhere in between, start at the shadow side and just sort of like hatch into it to start to create that gradation. Got to be careful with this and controlled. You don't want to be just blending. I want to be thinking as much as I can like a sculptor. Okay. So just continuing on here with the brow. I want to just lay this in. It's pretty dark. It's a little lighter than the shadow here on the eye socket, but it's still pretty dark. So, remember, we're compressing values all the time. We're compressing local contrasts, right? So I'm compressing this together in favor of that larger global context that we're going to be setting up. I can just kind of bring that down. This is mostly raw umber, or the French umber. Put a little of the violet in there, just neutralizes it a little more. When you're trying to mix up something that's pretty neutral, you can get there by many paths, So, in other words, you can get there by adding a whole bunch of different pigments together. If you're looking for something that's chromatic and high in value, you really only can start with the purity of the white and the really chromatic colors like the chrome yellow, the orange molybdate, and the vermilion. You've got to start there if you want to have something really, really intense. All right, just sort of stitching that together. Coming down here to the upper eyelid. So it's in the light. It's kind of a neutral value, or a mid value. And it tips more toward pink, right? So I've grabbed a little bit more of that vermilion and orange, mixing that with a little bit more white, but it's not competing really with anything going on up here. And then as that little sliver of, the conceptual sphere, as that's turning around, turning away from the light, it gets just a little darker and a little darker. So I'm painting, I like to paint pretty systematically, so I'm moving along the form, from form to form. And especially when you're learning, I think that's really helpful, rather than kind of dancing around, because you're looking to make really subtle adjustments. And usually if you just put a stroke here and a stroke there, then it misses something. You're missing attaching to the volumes. And that's, again, the mental space that you've got to be in. You've got to be treating your painting like it's a sculpture. You're creating its own little world back behind the picture plane. Here I'm grabbing a bit more of that vermilion so that it's a little bit more apparent. I really like to sort of push those cooler, bluer notes sort of right in this region, near the tear duct and the nasal bone. And just kind of merge that with the shadow as that plane tips away and then gets caught by the cast shadow here from the brow. All right, so we're sort of surrounding the eye. Might as well just sort of jump in there into the eye itself. And I like to just take the Van Dyke Brown, a little bit of the Oleo Res gel just to make it a touch darker and glossier. And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of drop in a dark for the pupil. So now we've really kind of completed the value scale. Things are going to get darker in subsequent passes and probably also a little bit lighter. But given the context of what I've set up today, I've gone from my lightest light, being the highlight that's on her forehead, now to the darkest dark, which is the pupil in her iris. And so it's the relationship of everything else between that's going to create our illusion. But that's just an assigning. Her pupil is darker than what I've got here. It's designed to absorb light, right? And so I can be pretty confident that if I choose a really dark note, then it's not going to be out of place or out of context. It makes sense, right? Now finding a little bit more color for the iris, sort of the yellower brown. So grabbing more of that transparent oxide yellow, a little bit of the yellow ochre, but it's getting lighter in value over here in this lower right kind of quadrant of the iris. That's where it's most perpendicular to the light, so that's where we see the brighter values and the most color. All right, but I'm trying to keep that nice and dark. If I take a kind of mental step back and I squint down just a little bit, all of the iris groups together as a dark. What I overwhelmingly will find with students when they try to paint the iris is they're really going to try to pop those contrasts and make the iris way too bright. So let's try to keep that value and everything grouping together. Let that we'll be able to get all kinds of value and make it look brilliant and sparkly later. But right now we're just setting up the larger value context. Okay. So now moving on here to I can see just a little kind of triangle of the wide of the eye before we get to the corner of the eye. So it's a little darker than the iris. I'm sorry, a little lighter than the iris, but very, very, very neutral. So basically the same for our purposes at this point. And then a little intermediate value for the edge of the upper eyelid. Trying to be very, very careful with the drawing here. We don't want any stray marks that start to make the drawing drift unintentionally. It's worth repeating that the only way that I really can mess this up, this underpainting phase, is if my drawing gets worse, if the drawing starts to drift. If I keep my drawing and the values are still kind of haywire and the chroma and hues are just a little bit off, okay, that's fine. We can work with that. But a drawing that gets worse, you're going to have to kind of put the brakes on and readdress, which I've had to do. That's okay. It's still fixable, but you're definitely taking a step backwards rather than advancing the picture. All right, so here looking at the down plane of the upper eyelid, I started introducing some redder notes. So I really basically just put some alizarin crimson right into the puddle and sort of in the neutral value. You can see like on my palette, there's just sort of this puddle that's kind of like growing in different, growing with different arms or whatever. So I've kind of got the darker hair and shadowy colors here. I've got the lighter, more perpendicular planes, and then this is sort of this neutral mid-value ground that I can then just mix into. But here we've just got crimson for those redder notes at the tear duct. Palette organization is very important, though, to try to keep track of what you're doing. The messier your palette gets in general, kind of that's a symbol for what's going on inside your head. So if it gets messy, it's best to just kind of clean it off, start over, and refresh. All right, the white of the eye is kind of a bluer hue. It's a mid-value, right? When I compare, I take that step back and I compare it to the highlight on her forehead. The white of the eye is not nearly as bright. I think just by the fact that we call it the white of the eye, sometimes it tricks people into making it, almost pure lead white, and just that contrast looks really silly. So I just grabbed a little bit of blue, more of that lead white, right into the puddle that's on my palette. Just kind of taking a guess here. Comparing it to the forehead in my picture, making sure this is many times brighter. And it's a little darker as it approaches the upper eyelid. It actually gets a little bit pinker then. The white of the eye gets a little pinker as it approaches the tear duct. So there's a little gradation that's happening there. Everything's gradating. We need to just keep working on all of those gradations rather than I'm not going to lay one stroke over the entire upper eyelid and make it the same value. Now looking at the down plane of the lower lid, it's certainly more red, in a red hue family more than anything else. I did add a little bit of that yellow ochre to kind of tip it back more toward the yellows. So it's a yellowish red, but predominantly more red. then it gets a little darker, a little more neutral as we move toward the right and approaching the corner of the eye. I can kind of just maybe bring that up for the upward facing plane of the lower eyelid. That's catching a little bit of light right there. Maybe I'll switch to a softer brush, and if I load it with, a decent amount of paint, it'll create a nice sharp point. What I want is a darker kind of reddish note here for the crevice shadow at the fold of the upper eyelid. And maybe make that a little darker. We kind of come around here. That's a little bit too red. So I can neutralize that. I could grab some green and grab some of the Van Dyke brown. Pushing those values darker. Still got my trusty mirror. Let's have a look here. All right. It's looking okay. We're doing the process. You got to trust the process and just move bit by bit. So let's move down to the cheek. Why not? Now, I generally like to paint light to dark. I know plenty of painters who will paint from dark to light. So whatever suits you. I think I find the lights to be more limiting, so that's the thing that I can compete with less relative to reality. So if I start there, then I kind of know how to key everything else relative to it. In my experience, when I painted from dark toward the light, I'll often go too light here, and then I'll run out of room for it to be high in value and high in chroma in these regions. So, but if that works for you, then do it, by all means. So here I'm looking for, pinker hues. Definitely the cheeks are pinker than the forehead. And this is the darker side of the face than that. So I need to make sure that I reserve some lighter values for over there. So this has just been white. I'm going to grab a little of the walnut oil to make that flow a little more, and vermilion, maybe a little bit more of the ochre. All right, but then that's neutralizing pretty quickly as it turns away and moves up on the cheekbone. So I grabbed some Viridian, French umber, maybe a little bit more of the ochre. A little more French umber, a little bit of Van Dyke brown, as I'm just trying to darken and neutralize that basic starting point and turn this cheek. Tip it away from the light. Maybe even a little more. So the paint facture here is still pretty thin. I can still see a good bit of the canvas peeking through in spots. So the painting will become more opaque tomorrow in that second pass. The lights will get lighter, the darks are going to get darker. And that's really going to be where we go for it, where we really go for the finished effect that we're after, leaving the final pass for the refining and polishing and just getting these beautiful subtle effects with glazes and things. But so this is like, this is like the setup. But keeping it thin, relatively. While I've got that kind of on the brush, I can kind of just bring this all the way down the length of the face. This is basically all the same plane relative to the light source, and so it's going to be basically the same value. There might be some hue shifts and things, but that's all extremely subtle, and a lot's going to change by the time we get to that level of subtlety. So I think it makes sense to just sort of bring that all the way down. All right, now back up to sort of the lighter passages in this cheek here. So white, orange, a little vermilion. Maybe that's too colorful, so a bit more white to bring it up higher in value, and the white will also neutralize it. Now as the planes are turning away from the light, rolling into the side plane of the nose, it's getting darker again. A little bit more neutral. There definitely are some sort of chromatic reds in there where we get some shadow. There's probably, there's more capillaries in the skin. Maybe there's just the skin tone itself on the nose can often be just a little bit more chromatic, right? So there are local color changes. The skin is not a perfectly homogeneous hue throughout. But I always like to try to explain things to myself. I'm trying to understand what I'm seeing, why would it be like that? Because it's so easy to get tricked. It's so easy to think you see something and it's not actually there. There's also this idea of simultaneous contrast. So it's this, our brain is interpreting the world, right? It's not as if it's this completely impartial machine that's just feeding us data. It's interpreting what we see, right? And so this idea of simultaneous contrast happens in our brain. It's when you have a dark thing adjacent to a light thing, the contrast actually looks greater than what it actually is. Or for instance, so like this nostril that's catching some light, it's surrounded by a whole bunch of dark things, dark shadows on the nose. So it might trick my brain into thinking that it's lighter than it actually is. But I know I have to kind of counteract that with my knowledge. I know that the plane of that nostril is tipping really far away from the light in this direction in the room, and so therefore I need to make it dark. Okay? So you always want to be thinking, always want to be just sort of having a conversation in your head about just really basically the physics of light and like how is that happening, and how could I explain that to myself and make the best decision possible at this stage. So I'm just going to lay in this shadow now here as I've kind of started working my way into the nose. It's not a very dark shadow. It's open to a lot of reflected light. And it's definitely redder, so I could add more vermilion, I could add more crimson. Crimson might be a good choice because that maintains some transparency. But again, I'm just going to go ahead and flatten all that out. It gets a little lighter, maybe a little bit more yellow as we move toward the left because there's more reflected light over here on this side to fill this shadow. So I can kind of set up a little gradation. I've basically just gone over the the shadows of the nostrils themselves, and in favor of just unifying that whole thing. So then again, let's just take a quarter step up in value from the shadow and lay in the nostril. Maybe it's a little bit more colorful than that, but I don't know, it doesn't matter too much. All right, so let's approach the nose the same way that we did the forehead. It's just another version of that sphere, that conceptual sphere in our head. But it's going to go through all of the same basic planes as what we did up here. So I'm going to start with the plane that's most perpendicular to the light, just above and to the left of the highlight. The highlight's going to be here. But so this plane is the highest in value and the most chromatic. And it's pinker than the forehead. So I'm going to grab the lead white, maybe just a touch of the titanium for that added just higher value, and right into the orange. When you mix orange with white, it kind of tips pink. So it's a nice little mixture here. I'm going to grab a little bit more yellow just to sort of make that a little bit less pink. And I can just bring that same basic value all the way up the ridge of the nose. I think that could probably be lighter in value and more neutral. And so titanium will do both of those things. By adding titanium to the mixture, it both gets higher in value and it gets more neutralized. But again, I feel like I'm seeing maybe a little bit more yellow. All right, now we've got the highlight just to the right of that, so I'm going to just go into lead white, a little walnut oil, just so that it flows a little more, and then kind of lay that on. Maybe a little more. Okay, so back to kind of our starting nose value, kind of a high value, relatively high chroma pink. And then as it turns away, it's getting darker and lower in chroma. So I can grab the yellow ochre, a greater proportion of vermilion, and place that right here. Maybe into the raw umber to neutralize it a bit more. Just getting darker, lower in value, lower in chroma. And then starts to merge with the shadow. So I'm going to go back to a smaller brush or brush that makes a finer point, because these planes, these transitions start to happen more quickly again right there near the terminator. So this is where most of the value change happens. So you see that arc from high value, high chroma, aiming toward the shadow, darker and more neutralized. If you go in this direction, then it's just the same. But the point is I'm aiming for this plane, right? Not the highlight, I'm aiming for this plane. Working that transition here out of the shadow on the nose. Just a little lighter here. A little more chromatic. And so you can see how just very simply that relationship starts to create that that illusion of volume. And it's not the right shape yet. It's not exactly the right nose, but you know, we've taken a step forward where this is taking on that illusion. And now I'm just going to kind of bring those values up the side of the ridge of the nose, somewhere halfway between this value and the shadow. Maybe it could be a little bit brighter. It feels like the edge of the nose is kind of just sliced off there. I want to tip this back more toward the light. But see, I made that decision because I was experiencing like the volume, the shape of the nose that I had created, and I was comparing it versus the shape of her nose, the volume of her nose. I wasn't comparing the values, if that makes sense. Right? So the value that I'm placing here is because I've decided on this value because it's in between those two, and it results in a certain experience of volume, not because I'm saying, okay, this versus that on the nose. It's very, very important. Seems like it's just a little lighter right in here where the nasal bone sits underneath. All right. Before I move on the nose, I'm just going to kind of refine this a little bit. I think I can lay in the kind of darks for the nostril themselves. And I like to, rather than going for like a brown or a black, I like to see if I can push some color in there, because I do think there is a lot of light and color happening. So I basically went to crimson and Van Dyke brown. Now, especially I think that can be seen on the nostril on this side. So there's a lot of light just passing through there. It's like, that's called transmitted light, where the light is passing through the skin. It's kind of getting filtered out, and then it comes out, the other side, redder and actually pretty chromatic. It's like when you hold your hand over like a flashlight, and your fingers glow orange. It's the same sort of effect, obviously on a much more subtle scale, but I think that these sorts of ideas and distinctions are what can make the painting feel alive, like there's blood flowing through the skin.
you've learned only one path to developing your art, you may be limiting your own problem-solving skills. You can't do what you don't know how to do. This is why it's so important to study under different artists and instructors. You must learn multiple methods to navigate the unexpected difficulties any painting might throw at you. The risk of not having alternative problem-solving methods is perilous. You could be nearly finished with a grand painting and find yourself unable to go any further. Maybe you've experienced this already. With new insights, you'll see different paths and have multiple ways of dealing with issues that come up as you start and progress through a painting. In classical portraits, artist Joshua LaRock will show you his proven methods to investigate issues. Think clearly through each option and decide on the best way to proceed. Never again will you be held up because you don't know how to get past the problems you encounter while developing your painting.
It's a simple question, but it's more than just good drawing. It's more than just getting the likeness, you know. If we get this right, we translate something of our sitters' personality, something of their humanity and their essence. So it's kind of elusive, but it's really, really satisfying, really, really challenging.
Josh is recognized as one of the preeminent figurative artists living today. His paintings are rooted in classical techniques, yet filtered through a contemporary sensibility.
I'm really influenced by William Bouguereau. He's a 19th century French academic painter. And so what I'm going to be showing you here is more or less what I've gleaned from his processes. More than the method or the process or the materials, specific materials that I'm using, I want you guys to be able to take away some problem-solving tools that you can use in your studio to do self-learning and hopefully kind of dispel a lot of the confusion.
He combines the best of age-old techniques with a positive, modern approach to his subject matter. Josh's tried-and-true solutions will be a new and refreshing approach as he encourages you, especially while you're learning to break things down into components rather than tackle everything at once. Now you have the opportunity to learn to achieve these great results for yourself. Available on both DVD and digital format to view on your computer, tablet, or smartphone. Order Classical Portraits with Joshua LaRock today.
Well, that just happened to be a segment from Classical Portraiture from Joshua LaRock, one of our best-selling videos, and you can learn more about that at lilyartvideo.com. Now let's get to know Joshua a little bit. Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur, and welcome to Interviews with the Artist. Today I have Josh LaRock in the studio with us. Josh, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm really thrilled to have you because you're such an accomplished painter and doing so many wonderful things in the art world, so welcome.
I appreciate it, yeah. I'm glad to be here and glad to be working with you guys, yeah.
So how did this whole thing happen? You fell in love with art at a young age? What happened? You're a pretty young guy.
Yeah, well, maybe I can't say that for too much longer, but yeah, no. I mean, my dad drew and painted as I was growing up. You know, he was a hobbyist and things like that. So I had it around, and I kind of just thought it was something that was sort of normal. I think some of my earliest influences was Bob Ross. You know, I would love to come home and watch him on the on PBS after school. But yeah, I don't think I really knew that this was like the passion of my life. That this was where I was going to take my career. For a long time. I was doing music for a long time in high school and college. And
what kind of music?
Well, I started off, I was a percussionist, and then I was a drummer, and then I picked up the guitar, and I thought I was going to go in a jazz direction for a little bit, and then I did music business once I kind of realized I wasn't going to be a performer.
Now, why was that? Did you just feel you weren't talented enough?
No, I don't know. I just don't think it was me.
Yeah.
You know, I just don't think that was I was a performer at heart, that I wanted to spend that much time in the practice rooms or go on tour or things like that. Loved music, and that was why I had picked it up. But yeah. Anyway, so my path was a winding one to find my way into art. It wasn't
Not
until,
unusual.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very common story when I talk to other colleagues and things.
So what I'm curious about is that typically in, let's say, the teenage years, we tend to rebel against what our parents are into. Did you find yourself doing that at all? You know, saying, I don't want to do what Dad's doing.
I don't know if it was rebellious. I think I had it in my head that I was going to make sure I loved what I did with my life. You know, I think I saw a lot of people around me. I don't know if it was necessarily my parents or anything, but I just think that it was a common experience to find people who didn't love what they got to go do every day at work, and I didn't want to be that. You know, so I was trying to find something that I felt was meaningful, that I was passionate about, something that I felt like had a grand purpose for culture, whatever. You know, I tended to be pretty idealistic. So I don't know if I don't think it was rebellion so much that was driving me, but just sort of this bright-eyed idealism that I was chasing. So, yeah.
So what happened then?
You mean after music business?
Yeah.
So I was.
You went to college for music business?
I did, yeah. So I got my degree in music business.
Where?
University of Colorado.
Okay.
And so I did a lot of interning because there's, music business is a broad field, and so I could do record producing or concert promotion or radio or whatever. So I was interning at a bunch of different places, and I found myself in Charlottesville, Virginia. I was working for the management company that the Dave Matthews Band, his manager, had founded, and they also had a record label as well. So there were kind of a bunch of things I could do there. But I was working for the management side of it, the artist management side, and that would actually have been a decent career path within the industry, and particularly at that time because that was right when nobody knew how to make money selling records anymore because Napster had kind of like blown everything up.
Right.
Anyway, so I was in Virginia, and I was just kind of getting this feeling that this isn't the thing that I'm passionate about. You know, going back to, is this going to be something that I'm going to be happy doing for the rest of my life? So around that time, I had been starting to find artists that were really inspiring to me. Sargent was one of the very first, who was finding websites that were dedicated to him online. And so I just was eating up everything that I could about his life and about how he studied and what that was like. And so I came across that he had studied at an atelier, the French word for studio, under Carolus Duran in the 19th century in France. And I didn't know what atelier was at the time, so I just Googled it. I typed it in there, and that brought me to the Art Renewal Center and their list of approved ateliers. And so then I just started finding out about, there were all these, small schools across the country, and there were several in Italy that were teaching artists. So this was all a revelation to me. And since I was on the East Coast, I decided, all right, I'm going to visit 3 that are, in some sort of close proximity to me, and then kind of see where it goes. So I went up to New York to visit Jacob Collins' school, the Water Street Atelier. I visited Nelson Schenk's school, Studio Incaminati, and then Jeffrey Mims, who is in North Carolina. And New York is New York, so that kind of won me over. I'd been there a couple times before in college, and so I decided I'm just going to move there and see where it goes.
You probably don't realize how lucky you are.
Oh, yeah.
And what I mean by that is when we started Fine Art Connoisseur, there were maybe 3 ateliers in the world, maybe 4. And, of course, there was no internet. And people who wanted to learn to paint this kind of art, first off, didn't know anybody was doing it anymore. It didn't exist in the public eye. And what a typical art student would do is go to either an art school or to a college with an art program, and they didn't do this kind of art anymore. They weren't teaching figurative drawing anymore. They weren't teaching the classics. So your timing, I mean, even Art Renewal Center didn't exist, and so your timing was perfect in terms of coming in at this time when the perfect storm of the internet and Art Renewal Center and some ateliers starting. Of course, now there's so many more ateliers than than there had been.
Oh, it's growing like crazy.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah, it's really neat to see. I mean, just in the last 10 years I moved to New York in 2006. But you're right. I mean, I completely believe it. And I've talked to artists who are just, half a generation ahead of me. And just the lack of resources and the ability to find their way into like-minded schools and situations and things. I mean, I had felt some of that, going to school. I had, in college, I did think about art at one point, but I walked into the art department and I could just tell it wasn't technical. There wasn't going to be any technical kind of instruction. I don't think I knew what I wanted. I didn't know enough to know what I wanted. I just knew it wasn't that. But you're right. I mean, so once I did find out about it, then there were resources and there were ways for me to get access to it. So
you ended up going to school at Grand Central with Jacob Collins?
Yeah, well, so that's what it became. When I showed up, he was still running a smaller
Water Street,
what was known as Water Street. Though it wasn't in Brooklyn, it was in 69th Street in Manhattan, in his personal studio.
I was there at that time.
Right.
You may have been there at the same time. Who knows?
Yeah,
there were a lot of students there.
Yeah. So that was a really cool environment. But then he started the Grand Central Atelier shortly after I had arrived, and then eventually merged the two schools.
So help everybody understand what that atelier experience is like.
Yeah.
Because I think that's important to understand the foundational principles of training.
Okay.
What did they put you through?
Well, I mean, so it's all practical based study. So you show up, and the first year, at least at the time, was all drawing. So we started drawing in graphite on white paper from the plaster cast, and so this was just this beginning place to try to start figuring out how to draw accurately and how to create the illusion of 3 dimensions.
Did they do any barg drawings?
Not at the time when I studied, but they do now. Yeah,
I see.
Right. So that's even like one step, prior to cast. So you're copying 2 dimensions to 2 dimensions in sort of a barg situation, and trying to kind of learn through, osmosis, almost like the taste of these 19th century masters.
For the people who are watching that might not know what barg is,
Sure.
Would you explain that?
Yeah. So Charles Barg, he studied with Jerome in the 19th century and was an amazing painter in his own right. But Jerome had this idea to put together this drawing course, basically, that was a series of lithographs that were themselves mostly cast drawings, right? So they were small drawings of eyes and noses and mouths and full busts of heads and things from the antique, so Greek and Roman statuary and things like that. And then there was part of the book is also figure drawing sketches and things like that. So the idea was that these lithographs could be reproduced, in the latter half of the 19th century and widely distributed, so that people had access to, good drawing and painting instruction. And so people are still using that now. They're rediscovering this. They put together a great book. I think it was Ackerman who put together the Barg book now that we have, which is a compilation of these plates. And so we can use these just as a way to learn how these artists are thinking, and how do I draw accurately? How do I get good proportion?
Mm-hmm. So you though started out with cast drawing,
Right.
Which probably was pretty difficult as a first-time drawing experience.
Yeah. It's not easy, and it's definitely a challenge to spend weeks on a drawing.
Yeah.
When you're not used to that
that's
idea.
got to be the toughest thing, is developing the patience.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly one thing you need to be an artist, and that's patience, I think. Because so much of it's an art of subtlety, really, when it comes down to it. And so you've just got to take that time to observe and be able to, make these very minor adjustments. So I think that's what I learned with cast drawing. But you do a series of them. And so that was what was really helpful, I think, about the program of study, the curriculum, as loose a term as that. The curriculum is, I think maybe overselling it. It was this basic idea that you were going to just start simply, do one cast drawing, do just a mouth, right, of Michelangelo's David, do just the eye of Michelangelo's David. And then so you do a couple of them, and you'll do a slightly harder one the second time. You'll have gone through the whole process, you'll learn a little bit more, and then you'll get a little bit better at it. And then you would take what you learned in cast drawing and graphite, and then you would apply that to cast painting. So now you're trying to paint the cast, and but now you're grappling with handling your medium. But it's all in black and white.
Now, are they giving you a lot of instruction along the way in terms of how to handle things, or are they letting you kind of discover it on your own?
Well, I think now it's a lot. There's a lot more instruction at the Grand Central Atelier. There's a lot more consistent instruction, days per week. But yeah, I mean, at the time, Jacob would come by every now and again as he had time, because he was working as an artist. That was, I think, kind of like the main thing that was pretty unique about that situation, is being able to see him do his own work in that environment. But then he had former students come in, and they would teach us and give us feedback and paint on the painting and show us how to do it a little better. But slowly over the time, you just it starts to click.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So the importance of this foundation of drawing, though, is absolutely critical. And the tendency for people is to want to kind of fast forward to the meat and potatoes right away. What is your best argument for really taking the time and learning the drawing?
There's just no way around it. I mean, I think I say that every time I give a workshop. Most of the time, I think people are coming to the workshops. They're interested in figuring out how I'm using glazing and scumbling techniques. They have all these questions about the mediums that I'm using and the particular colors on the palette. And I always say that, I mean, the magic is not there. The magic is not in those mediums. It's everybody, across the board needs help with drawing, and particularly when it comes to portrait painting. I mean, it's paramount with landscape, still life, any of the disciplines or genres, but particularly with a portrait, you've got to draw accurately in order to be able to get expression and likeness, because you can make it look like a person vaguely, but getting it to look like that person and getting it to have some sort of their essence and their personality might go beyond drawing. Like there's something more than drawing, but not less. Does that make sense? You know what I mean? So you're not going to be able to get that if you haven't drawn accuratally. So.
I think that you're right. This idea of mediums and art materials and brushes, I equate it to buying better golf clubs is going to make you a better golfer. It has nothing to do with it. I mean, maybe there's going to be a subtle difference between product A and product B, but it really is about that foundational learning.
For sure. Yeah. I always like to quote Ingres, the 19th century French painter again, and he would say that painting is 90% drawing. It's all there but the color, and I just think that's so true, and people really need to try to take that to heart.
So you go from your drawing into painting, and then what happened next?
Are you talking about in
the school?
In the studying. Yeah. So you take drawing and graphite, then you take painting and grisaille, which is just black and white, painting the cast, and then all the while you're drawing and painting from the figure, right? So concurrently, so you're doing kind of like half a day in cast drawing, half a day figure drawing.
So even in year one, they started you out painting or drawing.
That's what it was. That's what it. I think there's some variations on that in the current course, but that's the basic idea. So and then you're painting the figure in grisaille, right? So everything's just getting a little bit harder, but you're not having to juggle everything at once. Right?
Yeah, because the minute you throw color into the mix, it just complicates everything, right?
The variables grow exponentially.
Yeah. So learning your values, learning in the grisaille, learning your values being your darks to lights.
Yeah.
Learning that you're stacking things, right? Drawing. Now you're thinking about drawing. Now you're thinking about dark to light, about values and shadow, and you're doing that, I guess, in drawing too. And then what was the next step?
So then once you felt proficient at that, then you would paint in full color. So the last year-ish of my studies was just doing 2 a day, where in the morning you're you're painting in full color from the figure, and in the afternoon you're painting in full color from the figure. And these were still long poses, so these were about 4-week poses, and so you do 2 each month, and so then it was just trying to put everything together, and at some point, how do you start making works of art? They're figure studies, you know what I mean? They're academic figure studies, but how do you then start to transcend that? And there were some workshops along the way where we did still lives, so that's a little bit more about how do I make a picture, you know.
Well, that's always the difficult part is that transition point. It is, you know, I was reading Ives Gammell last night, and Gammell talks about that you have to get to the point where you know that technology is second nature, the technology of painting, so that you can express yourself by knowing what to do.
Right.
But then, how do you learn how to make it a picture or to express the emotions of the person you're painting? How do you make that leap? Is that something they teach you in the school, or is that something you have to kind of learn on your own afterwards?
Yeah, it wasn't, at the time for me, it wasn't something that we talked about a ton. I mean, we would discuss it, but it was really a lot more technically based, and just trying to, the main project was sort of just continuing to recover this skill and get it out to more people. That's a difficult, I mean, it's a tough thing to figure out how to articulate, really. How do you make a good composition? How do you, it's kind of like trying to describe how to be a good poet. You know, I mean, you can learn grammar and you can learn the aspects.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, but what is that?
Right.
I don't, you know.
Right.
But you know a good poem. I mean, I think it's not completely, you know, nebulous and totally subjective. So I think there are ways to understand how to make a good composition, how to think about color harmony, how to think about the emotional hook of a picture. But yeah, I think this exists somewhere in, you know, a different realm.
If you were inventing the ultimate school, knowing what you know now with several years, how many years since you graduated?
10.
10 years. So a decade of experience on your own. As an artist, you've had to figure a lot of things out.
Sure.
If you could redesign the atelier system or your own school, what would you add? What would you subtract? What's been missing? And this isn't being critical of anyone.
No, it's a good question. I mean, I've thought about it, you know, a good deal. I mean, I felt very fortunate to have found that study. It really made a lot of sense to me, and the pace of it was self-paced, so you know, you were able to take it as you needed, and I think that was very valuable. I do think that there's kind of this need now, maybe for more of like a postgraduate sort of thing, where so you take what's essential out of the technical side of things. It's just how do you draw and paint well. But then how does somebody learn how to be an artist? So if they could be in a working studio, in a working artist studio, and learning aspects of the business, how do you make a living at this? How do you juggle all the hats that you have to put on? That's a huge aspect of it. But then more so, how do you also now make works of art? So that maybe there's this sort of like in-between space, you know, where this is a very skilled person who's come out of the academic study.
There's a system in Russia. Of course, Russia has some of the best training in the world.
Oh, sure.
And the very best of the best students then are brought into a postgraduate program for, I think it's for 3 or 5 years. All of their expenses are paid. Their studio is provided for them. And they're told, this is the one time in your life, while you're young, while you're energetic, you're going to be able to essentially get out there and do monumental paintings. And we want you to do big multi-figure paintings where you don't have any pressure of making a living. And this was created by a couple of brothers who fund this because they wanted to take the best of the best and help them get to those points that you talked about. How do you become an artist? How do you take it to the next level?
Well, that sounds ideal. I mean, it's particularly the part about having some funding behind you, so that you have time to not just, you know, go out there and try to, you know, sell something right away. You have some time to take these things and figure out how to, you know, realize your vision and figure out who you are as an artist.
Well, as you know, I teach art marketing, and one of the things that I have been saying to all the schools is we need art marketing discussed in the schools, because you take a young student, pull them out of school, and all of a sudden they have that expectation of, I've got to make a living. Now, I will say that where you come out of school matters. The training that you've received matters, because there are, for instance, some galleries that will instantly grab people out of certain schools because they know they're going to be good. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to make a living.
Right.
And to be able to prepare the soil, so to speak, plant those seeds, teach them how to do the marketing, I think would be something that should be part of the curriculum of all art schools, quite frankly.
Yeah, I mean, no question. They're gonna have to learn it at some point.
Yeah, I mean, you have to know how to run your business, and this, by the way, is a problem in medical schools. You know, that they graduate, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, hey, by the way, you're in business. All of a sudden you're hiring people and dealing with insurance and accounting and you know, things that we don't want to have to deal with.
It's true. Yeah, I mean, what's your best idea for getting those and getting some sort of curriculum into those programs? Do you have?
Probably the best idea would just be recording something and make it an online program that they all have access to, because for them the cost of trying to put that into their curriculums, especially, you know, you've got 100 schools around the country or around the world now. I think, you know, to be able to have some kind of a place that they can just go to and get that probably makes the most sense.
Makes sense to me.
There's an idea. Maybe something that'll get done one day.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of ideas out there. So you graduated from Jacobs School.
Right.
And now you find yourself out there. What happens next?
Well, for me, I was fortunate enough to start teaching there shortly after I had left, and I actually think I kind of felt like that was an extension of my own studies, because as soon as you have to teach something, you find out what you know and what you don't. Right. Because you're trying to verbalize it in a way that, you know, has to be coherent.
You become a better artist when you teach.
Yeah, definitely. So I would certainly recommend that to anybody who's coming out of school. You know, teach as soon as you can. There's somebody out there who knows less than you do, and so that was really helpful to me. That helped, obviously, with financially, just to sort of kind of bridge the gap as I was coming out of school. And you know, of course, I was young. I could live cheaply and kind of just make that work for a while. So
living cheaply in New York isn't easy.
Well, as cheap as you can. Yeah, you know. So then it's just a matter of trying to figure out what is it I'm going to paint now. You know, and that was what that time was for me. I think I was always really dedicated to figurative work, and I again just sort of stumbled my way into portraiture, which is good, which is great. I didn't necessarily set out to be a portrait artist, though. I think I was good at getting likenesses, and I had a particular sort of affinity for detail, and that found an audience. But portraiture's always been one of the pillars of, you know, any of artists' careers throughout history.
Well, in a lot of ways, that put Sargent on the map. I mean, Sargent
Yeah.
was doing all the socialites in around the world, as a lot of Americans, and these, of course, ended up in great collections and great museums. So it benefited him a lot. So you're doing a lot of commission work now.
I am, yeah.
So what's that world like?
Well, it's good. I mean, it's incredible how many different people I've been able to meet just through painting portraits, and all different kinds of walks of life and occupations in different parts of the world. I was doing a lot of portrait commissions in China for a while there, and that was never something I expected that I was going to be doing. But I experienced a completely different part of the world and completely different culture, and you know, it's different ideals of beauty, and learning things.
So how do you deal with that? Because the ideals of beauty in China are going to be different than what we would have here. Do you have to study that? Do you have to ask a lot of questions? Because what you like and what they like might be completely different.
Well, sure. It was kind of trial by fire, honestly. I mean, I just started doing them, and then you'd send photos for approval, and they'd say certain things, but they were just things that I didn't expect. Just about, you know, had something to do with like the shape of their face or that are different than what we would assume, in terms of like how people are photoshopping their photos. It's just different there than it is here. But so I just started to learn that and pick it up, and then I would make the changes before they told me to, in the sort of, the latter ones. But yeah, so portrait painting is an interesting, it's an interesting world, and I'm happy to do it. I think certainly a lot of it depends on your client and what their expectations are, and so learning how to deal with clients. I mean, just get along with them and understand what they're.
You're doing, from what you've told me, you're doing some pretty prominent people around the world, and they're finding you, and it's resulting in some beautiful portraiture.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, I'm certainly giving it a shot, and the goal obviously is to make these not just portraits but also works of art.
Right.
Which is what Sargent accomplished.
And I think that's a huge difference, because there's a culture of what I would call portrait painters, people who are doing judges and lawyers and city council members or whatever, and some of them are beautiful,
sure.
But there's a big difference between that kind of a portrait artist and a portrait artist who's focusing on creating what we would consider to be a museum quality work of art. And it's a very subtle difference.
Right, yeah, I mean, again, it's an art of subtlety. It's your choices that you're making in terms of the pose, background, colors. Some of it has to do with the technique, I think, certainly, but yeah, it's what is that? I don't know. I think I try to put my finger on that all the time, but I don't know exactly what it is. So anyway.
Well, we have a conference called the Figurative Art Convention and Expo. And we try to focus on the museum quality there. There are a lot of people who do portraiture and do figures, and we try and attract the people who are really focusing on making that museum quality work. You're going to be at one of them coming up.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it as well, as are a lot of people who are going to be attending. So you have other dreams, though, of things that you'd like to accomplish. You love doing commissioned work. What are some of those other dreams? What do you see yourself doing down the road when you're able?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I love telling stories. I think that's the medium of painting. That's really what spans the test of time. And it doesn't mean that there needs to be some elaborate story, but just something that's emotional, something that is obviously very beautiful and timeless. So, I mean, that's the sort of broadest way to sort of describe it. But I think I want to do more multi-figurative things. I'd love to do larger format things that the paintings that when I walk into museums that I'm just blown away by. Your Van Dycks or Rubens or whatever. So I think building towards that, because there's a whole host of things that go along with trying to put something like that together.
Massive effort. I don't think people realize the amount of time and effort to do a big painting like that. Everything in terms of time is amplified.
Sure.
Getting the figures, even stretching the canvas. I mean, everything is.
It's incredibly difficult. The costs, model costs. Yeah, I mean, the time cost alone is what makes it difficult, and then just finding the outlet for it. Trying to find where's this going to go, where's this going to be purchased or be displayed. The larger you go, then there's the kind of the market tends to shrink. Just depending on exactly where your market is, and right. there are certain niches, and I'm
right.
sure
not everybody can hang a big painting in their house.
Right.
I'd like to talk about this realism movement, because I think this relates to that. When we started Fine Art Connoisseur, this realism movement was really, really tiny. There were a small number of people. There were, a handful of ateliers and a handful of artists who were trying to bring back the classics. And though they were not trying, my sense is they were not trying to replicate the past. They were trying to put classics in a contemporary environment, meaning classics for today. Art had gone far, far away from that, right? So starting with the Armory Show in, what was it, 1911, I believe. The Armory Show is when the modernists were first shown in New York, and then it kind of spread. And those modernists were all classically trained. And then the next generation of modernists said, well, I can do that. I don't have to be classically trained. And then, of course, it's gone, the pendulum has gone far, far out. So people who are making livings that are abstract expressionists and so on, and I'm not being critical of that, it's just that they didn't have to have that kind of training. And so it appears, though, the pendulum is swinging back. And it appears to me that, there's always a generation or two where things move in a different direction. So kids tend to not do what their parents and grandparents wanted to do. And what we're seeing is an explosion of young people who, like yourself, and a lot of people who are fresh out of college or going into college, 20 years old, who are wanting to do this kind of art instead of wanting to do the things that are hanging on their parents' or grandparents' walls. Why do you think that is?
That's a good question. I mean, I think like anything else, there's many factors. I do think there's just this just simple kind of wow factor in being able to draw and paint something that looks like something. So I think generally people are kind of like always drawn to that, and maybe it just culturally wasn't at the forefront for however many decades in the 20th century. I think certainly the internet has played a role in the ability of people to find out that this is happening, and things like Instagram, we can have these love-hate relationships with these things, but they allow people to build followings and to get excited about things that are out there and have access to things that they would otherwise probably not see. So I would say that has a lot to do with that. I mean, I have some quite a large subsection of my followers from Iran on Instagram.
We were having that discussion yesterday. Why are we getting so many people from Iran? And yet there seems to be a lot of love and passion. These are not. Some people buy followers from foreign countries and so on just to build their audiences. So this is not that. These are people who are truly interested.
But how cool is that? I mean,
it's fabulous.
But I think because it's completely out of different cultures, it's completely out of sort of like the, I think in the 20th century it was just smaller and tighter. There were fewer people who controlled what was going to get out there, particularly in universities and what was taught. And so there's just gatekeepers are losing their power, and so. But I mean, if somebody still wants access to that, fine, they can have access to it. But this other thing is still vital, and it's growing.
So if you're living in a place, maybe like Iran or anywhere in the world, and you don't have access to an atelier or to a really brilliant instructor, what's your best advice for people?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a tremendous amount of good information and instruction you can get online now. Certainly videos. I know many people who are just absorbing that. I think that the person who is inquisitive and studious, hardworking, willing to put in the time to practice, they can find, they can problem solve, and they can find that information through those materials. And so that's. Devour as much as you can. Think. I would tell them to think as much as they possibly can about, the techniques themselves are understandable, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? So you can go out there and you can problem solve, and it's not just this sort of subjective, nebulous thing. So
what are the dangers of being self-taught, practicing? There's a line that I heard recently: practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanence.
Right.
So if you're practicing something that's, let's say, drawing, and you're practicing bad drawing skills, how do you get around that?
Right. Well, you could potentially find certain techniques that you're going to eventually have to unlearn because if they're just something about the particular ideals that just don't add up. So I get a lot of students, who will come from just different academies or different philosophies, and if I can just explain to them these simple ideas of form and light and how that works. It's just like light bulbs go off, because it's an underlying principle that makes sense, that's logical, and that you can think about and find the right answer, like math or science or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. There tends to be a badge of courage of being self-taught, and to me, I think that is folly.
Sure.
And the reason I say that is because the way that we have learned to paint was by being passed from generation to generation, you know, whether it was Rembrandt or others who were passing it on to their students and spending years, in some cases, with those people and helping formulate that, versus going out there and experimenting. You waste so much time.
Oh, sure.
And it seems like the best possible way is to study under somebody who's already figured it out.
Well, it's so much more efficient. I mean, let you know, all of their problem solving and all of their dead ends just, you know, fuel you, so you don't have to go down all those different
That's
paths.
right.
Yeah.
You don't have to make those mistakes.
Sure.
You're going to make plenty anyway.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, Josh, this has been fabulous today. It's fun to learn about you and to learn about your career, the path that you took. I just want to acknowledge you. You're a fabulous painter. You're inspiring a lot of people. And to think that at your relatively young age that you're as accomplished as you are, I just can't wait to see what you're doing when you're my age. And I'll be here watching.
All right. Well, thanks so much. It's been a lot of fun to talk to you, and I really do want to help. You know, I want to help others and find sort of their way into this, and so I hope I'm playing some small part in that.
It shows. It absolutely shows. I think it's important.
Thanks.
Well, this has been Interviews with the Artist, and this is Josh LaRock. Thanks again for watching. I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur magazine. Well, that segment was from Classical Portraiture with Joshua LaRock. We hope you enjoyed it. You can learn more about it at lilyartvideo.com. I'm Eric Rhodes. Thanks for watching today.
If you've learned only one path to developing your art, you may be limiting your own problem-solving skills. You can't do what you don't know how to do. This is why it's so important to study under different artists and instructors. You must learn multiple methods to navigate the unexpected difficulties any painting might throw at you. The risk of not having alternative problem-solving methods is perilous. You could be nearly finished with a grand painting and find yourself unable to go any further. Maybe you've experienced this already. With new insights, you'll see different paths and have multiple ways of dealing with issues that come up as you start and progress through a painting. In Classical Portraits, artist Joshua LaRock will show you his proven methods to investigate issues. Think clearly through each option and decide on the best way to proceed. Never again will you be held up because you don't know how to get past the problems you encounter while developing your painting.
It's a simple question, but it's more than just good drawing. It's more than just getting the lightness, you know. If we get this right, we translate something of our sitters' personality, something of their humanity and their essence. So it's kind of elusive, but it's really, really satisfying, really, really challenging.
Josh is recognized as one of the preeminent figurative artists living today. His paintings are rooted in classical techniques, yet filtered through a contemporary sensibility.
I'm really influenced by William Bouguereau. He's a 19th century French academic painter, and so what I'm going to be showing you here is more or less what I've gleaned from his processes. More than the method or the process or the materials, specific materials that I'm using, I want you guys to be able to take away some problem-solving tools that you can use in your studio to do self-learning, and hopefully kind of dispel a lot of the confusion.
He combines the best of age-old techniques with a positive, modern approach to his subject matter. Josh's tried-and-true solutions will be a new and refreshing approach as he encourages you, especially while you're learning to break things down into components rather than tackle everything at once. Now you have the opportunity to learn to achieve these great results for yourself. Available on both DVD and digital format to view on your computer, tablet, or smartphone. Order Classical Portraits with Joshua LaRock today.